I won't be able to see it while I'm presenting. I'm going to turn my camera off while I'm presenting so that I can, you know, optimize bandwidth and all that kind of good stuff. But I won't be able to see. Hold on just a second. You've got to get yourself and the cat out of here. Okay. Sorry. Small. Anybody here? I'm sure we're all parents or something like that. I'm going to turn my camera off. And I won't be able to see your Q&A while I'm presenting. So if you've got a question, take yourself on mute and I'll try to ask it. Okay, fair enough? All righty. Get back into where I was. All right, so here's our agenda. We're going to talk about some general concept of database migration journey and the tools you might use, what you might select for your database migration. Am I sharing this? Hold on one second, sorry. All right. So we're going to talk about database migration journey and your tools. And your journey is anything from your conception to your proof of concept work to your moving it into a dev area or staging area and maybe making changes, all that good stuff, and then getting into a mode where you're ready to go into production and go live with in your post-migration world and some of the tools you would use to do that. And then specifically, we'll talk a little bit about the Azure Database Migration Service. We'll talk about the Database Migration Assistant. And there's a couple of things that you need to know about the Data Migration Assistant and the Database Migration Service. The Database Migration Assistant will do your schema, will do your assessment. It'll do an assessment of whether or not you're ready to move, and it'll look for things that'll break, compatibility issues, feature changes. But your database migration service will move, your database migration system will do the assessment and also the database migration, except for the Azure SQL managed instance. It'll do the assessment on the managed instance, but it won't move the data on the managed instance. So you'll have to use the Azure Database Migration Service, and I'll show you that. If you want to take a look at workloads and how your SQL Server has been performing and what you might need to flag or take a look at, you can do workloads against a trace or an extended event or an extended event capture to take a look at how your SQL Server performs. You can also do if you're doing an Azure SQL managed instance from SQL Server on-prem or a SQL Server running on a VM, you can also do backup and restores. You can back up and restore from SQL Server on-prem or on a VM to Azure managed instance, or from SQL Server on-prem out into SQL Server running on an Azure VM. With the SQL Server running on an Azure VM, you can go both ways. You can send it back down, I believe, to on-prem if you needed to. SQL Server Management Studio, we'll look at some of the options. We really won't go into them too much, but you can do things like the import and export wizard. There's an Azure Migration Wizard in SQL Server Management Studio. There's also a DACPack and backpack export, which is really the schema of a database and the data of a database, moving those from SQL Server to Azure SQL Managed Instance. We'll also take a look at the Data Migration Cookbook, and then we'll take a look at references for further learning. And then again, I'll post the locations of the slides and the recording here that we're doing right now on meetup.com NOVASQL. So let's take a look at migrating to Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance. And there's really 4 key phases for your planning scope. You want to assess what your current data environment is, maybe certain hardware configurations that you have for storage, memory, processor. Do like a rough comparison to what you would need into the cloud. Certainly involve your stakeholders, developer teams. Calculate what your total cost of ownership is. How much do you pay for your data center rack space, the storage, backups, network infrastructure, physical security at the data center, and all that kind of good stuff, and kind of wrap that in as a current cost, and then compare that to what it would cost to migrate out to a cloud provider, Azure. And then discover and evaluate the applications that are connected to that database. I mean, I've had I've had some rough migrations and I've had some smooth migrations. The more rough migrations are when I've been told as a database administrator back in the day to just take the databases offline, back them up, and put them on remote storage. And then about a month later, you get somebody coming up saying, hey, my report is broken because this data element's not there because of some legacy application that's been taken down, and you didn't do that, or you didn't know because the application and the discoverability wasn't really done thoroughly, or it's not always the data team's fault. It's, you know, other stakeholders, other developers not chiming in when you say, hey, I'm taking database B down. Does anybody have an application that connects to database B? And you wait, and you send another email, we're taking it down for sure, and still no one chimes in, so you take it down, and then all of a sudden 800 hands raise up about something that's broken. So anyway, so the point there, make sure you go through a thorough assessment. And then once you get ready to move into the migrate phase, you'll select a migration strategy. If you're moving out into Azure SQL or Azure Managed Instance, you'll want to take a look at maybe if you've got on-prem SQL and you've got an Azure Managed Instance, you can literally take a backup from your on-prem SQL and then move that .back file out into Azure storage. And there's some stuff that goes on behind the scenes. You know, the managed instance, the Azure SQL managed instance needs to see that Azure storage as well and see that file, that .back file, but you can do a straight up restore from a on-prem backup or a backup that's on a virtual machine. Or you might want to use the migration tools that we're going to talk about this morning to move your data. You might have third-party tools, or certainly I think Attunity has some really good migration tools. And your migration might not be a one-shot and you're done process. You might migrate and then need to have some type of synchronization that's ongoing that maybe our tools don't meet the need for. And then you apply the strategy. You actually do the migration, and you know, the sleepless nights and all that. You kind of step through the migration and see what needs to be connected, reconnected, reran, and all that good stuff. And then once you migrate, you would optimize, you would analyze what your costs are for your new environment, what are the monthly charges for Azure SQL database. Have you over or under provisioned the Azure SQL database or the Azure Managed Instance? There might be some types of savings that you might get with your account team from Microsoft or other cloud providers that offer you a discount or offer you savings with resource reservations. The bottom line is the goal, not the bottom line, but the goal is to be able to have some more operating funds for you to reinvest to do more, and to be in the salad days is where you are no longer worrying about things you used to do on your legacy hardware related to infrastructure bottlenecks or operational issues that were pain points. Ideally, in your new cloud-based environment, because you can expand and contract based on your business needs, you'll be able to focus on new areas that maybe your dev team or your operational / dev DBAs had not been able to do previously, but now they can jump into other features. So there's not any, in my opinion, there's not any job loss around moving out to the cloud. There's only more opportunity. There's so many more bells and buttons and knobs to push, if you will. And then once you assess, migrate, optimize, you move into a secure and manage phase. All of our security across the Azure SQL, all the way down to our SQL Server on-prem, all have transparent database encryption, always encrypted technology, row-level security, dynamic data masking. All the security pieces flow through, so you're not really losing anything by moving out to the cloud. Plus, you've got the myriad of onion layers of security around Azure networking, Azure infrastructure as a whole, that help to protect your data and to monitor both security and overall health in the cloud. So if you move through these phases, you should be able to go from on-prem to Azure without too much of a problem. So here are some tools that we're going to look at today. And again, there's third-party tools that you can use for your migration that don't even hit these. And you might also be moving from SQL Server out to another cloud provider. That's fine too. But this really focuses on moving from SQL Server into Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. So the first piece is the Database Migration Service, and you can do an offline or an online migration to Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance, and that's done through the Azure portal, and I'll step you through that momentarily, if I can get it to work. My database migration service kept erroring out over the past 2 days, so we'll see if it works. But I can get you through the basics of the wizard. One thing that is not on here, well, no, I was going to say there's an Azure Migrate project that's sort of the parent for a lot of data capturing for your assessments, and you'll need that as well as these tools. But there's also the the Data Migration Assistant. And the Data Migration Assistant will do an assessment of managed instances and Azure SQL database platforms. So it'll say, hey, we're moving this database from SQL Server into Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Management. Can you tell me what's going to either break or a feature that won't be available? And the DMA will be able to do that, and you'll be able to either go back and fix things or change your migration strategy if you need to, or maybe just drop a feature that you had been using with SQL Server on-prem. Also, we'll take a look at SQL Server Management Studio. And again, Management Studio is important because you can still hit all of the database services in Azure through through SQL Server Management Studio. We won't really look at Azure Data Studio, which is kind of the new piece for managing SQL or managing data platform technologies in Azure, storage, Databricks, Azure Synapse, notebooks, Azure Data Factory. That's Azure Data Studio. We're not going to look at that today. And then you can also take a look at the DEA, or the Database Experimentation Assistant. We'll kind of look at the outside of that, but know that what that does, it evaluates a target of SQL Server for a given workload. So you might have some type of heavy transaction window or some type of reporting functionality that's used by some component of SQL Server, and you want to know how that affects what the assessment might be, and your DEA will be able to do that. A good link to go to for different tools and different strategies is datamigration.microsoft.com. This link here on the right part of the slide is you're going from the continuum from on-prem data, maybe living in some kind of hybrid environment where you've got on-prem SQL servers and some kind of an Azure footprint, all the way out to the Azure SQL database or the Azure SQL managed instance. The datamigration.microsoft.com page will help you talk about these tools and other strategies to move your data out there. I'll just pause here in case we have any questions or comments. So I'll just pause really quickly because I can't see the comments from my vantage point. No, I'll keep going.
Good morning, Tim. This is
Good morning.
I know like Microsoft recently acquired Mover, which also helps for some of the Azure migration. So do we have any kind of detail, like how do we use with DMM to move on-premises to the cloud?
Could you repeat that question a little bit, kind of tease that out in just a second?
Yes, sure. So there is some service or tool called Mover, M-O-V-E.
Oh, Mover, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I know like that can be also used to leverage some cloud migration.
Right.
And it gives some more insight to the like on-premises and gives more suggestion compared to the SS like DMA.
Yeah.
So like where can we find more kind of detail or documentation on that?
I'll look up how to find out it. I'll look up about information about MoveAir and Attunity and other third-party tools and how they could be used and shoot it out to the discussion thread. But I don't really have a lot of information about MoveAir and the type of information it provides right now.
And I heard Microsoft already acquired Mover, so I think it's kind of integrated with the Azure.
Yeah, that's right. But I don't have a lot of documentation about MoveAir, but let me try to dig that up and get you a response of some type moving on down maybe early next week.
Sure, thank you.
Sure. Right, good question. So the question was, is there a place where there's more information about third-party tools, but also third-party tools that were recently bought, like MoveAir, which does an assessment of your on-prem environment, particularly SQL Server, very detailed analysis of the compute, storage, resources that are being used, and what your cloud-based needs would be. So I'll give you that. I'll take that as a due out to send out early next week. Okay. So there's a few tools for your on-premises journey. And I use the term journey, the slide uses the term journey, but you might have, and I know you might have several different platforms on your environment or on your data platform buffet, so to speak. It's a mixture of SQL Server and Oracle and MySQL, HD Insight, MongoDB, Postgres, AWS, Google Cloud, just a lot of different things. And that can be done with some type of assessment. Again, it might not be from us, like from Microsoft. It might not be done with SQL Server Management Studio or the Data Migration Advisor or the DEA, but some way to assess your data, and then leveraging Azure Database Migration Service or the assessment tool I'll show you will migrate data as well into Azure SQL Database, MySQL running on Azure Database, or might be moving out to a big data environment like our Databricks or Azure Synapse or Synapse Analytics, or even to Cosmos DB, which is our NoSQL offering. So for example, you might take a MongoDB workload and run it through the assessment tool or assessment tools that you might have, and then push it through the migration service, and then send it on to either a MongoDB for Cosmos. The Azure Database Migration Service, and be patient, there's a few slides here about Azure Database Migration Service, and they kind of get redundant. They do say the same thing. I'll be merciful with these slides. By the way, I'll get done with these slides here in a second and we'll go straight to the demo. So the Azure Database Migration Service, so it takes a look at your different data sources and provides an end-to-end solution for getting your on-prem data out into Azure. It's a fully managed Azure service. Database migration is done offline or online. You can migrate SQL Server and third-party database into Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance. And you can scale this out. So I believe I have a single core, maybe a double core node set up for my Azure Database Migration Service. But you can scale out the type of resources that are configured for your Azure Database Migration Service. Again, this is where the slides get redundant. This is a little bit more text, kind of based on the previous slide. Again, seamless end-to-end solution, near zero downtime, resilient, and you can migrate at scale for multiple sources, meaning you can scale out your Azure Database Migration nodes to become much more robust should you need to. And you can again move data from on-prem out into Azure. And again, here's a kind of a little bit more technical architecture of the migration service and the other components of Azure that it might involve. I mean, it's portal access, but you can also use CLI or PowerShell. You'd have Azure Storage that holds your state management data, your database migration service, resource provider that actually provides the actual migrations of the service. You'd have a service bus queue. You'd have a virtual machine server that's only for database migration service. And then you'd have your subnet that you use for your database migration service, and then your on-premises data sources. So you could have your SQL Server, for example, going from right to left, being pulled in by a database migration service onto Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance, for example. Sorry, a couple little extra knickknacks. Then there's the database, the data migration assistant. Again, the data migration assistant is, you can download it from the Azure portal once you start your migration project, or you can just download independently from the web our data migration assistant. It'll do an assessment of your on-prem SQL Server instances for migrating to one or more Azure SQL databases. You can do more than one at a time. You can maybe take a look at things like compatibility issues, deprecated features, behavior changes, migration blockers. If you've got something that's a blocker that needs to be resolved, it'll flag that. And you can migrate an on-prem SQL Server instance to a modern SQL Server instance. We have the Database Experimentation Assistant, which is this is kind of a little video of what you get with the assistant. So we'll take a second here to look at, the Data Experimentation Assistant, because I don't have it fully tricked out for a demo today, but it basically shows you query stats, error information, query plan information. It captures workloads that you tell it to, and will provide that information in a report. If you've got a replay server, it'll check for data there and use that as the data source for captured workload data. So the Database Experimentation Assistant, which is also a download from our site. Also, let's not forget about, you can use backup and restores. If you're going to move from SQL Server to a managed instance, you can take a full backup from a .back file, back it up, move it to Azure Blob Storage out of the cloud or Azure Storage, and as long as the managed instance can see that storage, I'm getting ready to do this as a demo. When it sees the storage, it'll see the file, it'll do the restore, and then off you run. And it's a really smooth way to do SQL Server to Azure SQL managed instance. Provide the existing backups and network share. You upload the backup files to Azure Storage. Your DMS will, actually you can upload it on your own. You don't need DMS, and then you can kick off the restore from SQL Server Management Studio. And then again, while we're talking about SQL Server Management Studio, you can use SQL Server Management Studio to kick off the Azure Migration Wizard. You can use SQL Server Management Studio to export a backpack, then import the backpack into Azure SQL Database, and the backpack is really the schema for you, and then you can get the data moved as well. You can also use import, export if you needed to. Like, for example, I had a customer within the past month. At first they said, we want to take 100 databases that we have on-prem, and we want one giant archive just out in the cloud. We don't really care about any kind of current application functionality. We just want the data out there. So I said, well, if you want 100 databases moved into one big one, there's no tool that does a migration like that. Like, you can't restore them into a database. I said, why don't you use the export and move your data like that. So they did that. Then they decided they needed schema. They needed objects. So then I suggested that they use the database migration assistant, because that'll do tables, data, but it'll also do your objects. It'll do your views, your store procedures, your trigger, all that good stuff, all your internal schema. It'll move that as well. Anyway, you've got to, that's part of the assessment plan when you're doing your migration. We'll take a look at this. This is the Azure migration, your database migration cookbook. This is let me go here. Pardon. So choosing your database migration path to Azure, this has a lot of information in it, and it's a book that you download, and it is really kind of good. It talks about different ways to migrate, the strategies, taking advantage of our different security features, step-by-step details on planning, optimizing, and implementing your cloud migration. So the database migration cookbook is a very handy tool, and it's a book that you go and download, and we'll send it to you. We also have the Azure Migration Center coming up. We have the Azure Migration Center, which the scope here is beyond the database. It's about migrating storage, migrating VMs, migrating other web apps, other resources out into Azure. And it talks about the journey, the program, the resources. Maybe you're looking for partners, or you want some more information on Azure migration. This is a good place to start, and it'll help you out on your migration journey. Let's see here. There's some references here for further learning. Oh, good. We're actually at that. We'll just be able to just do demo until we're done. Again, the main Azure portal, the Azure SQL database. These are two very general links about the technology in general. Then I have a link for the database migration service. I have a link for the database migration assistant, which has a download button inside of it. There is a link for the data experimentation assistant, a link for the database migration cookbook, the migration center, and then some generic links about the Azure regions. And then way at the bottom is our new link for Microsoft Learning, where we've taken down a lot of our different areas for online training and attempted to consolidate them. So we have docs.microsoft.com/learn. So Microsoft Learn is the good place to go for certification information, for training paths that apply to certain certifications. So go out to Microsoft Learn and you can, for free, really pick up some very good training. So I'm going to go out. Any questions? No. I'm going to go out to my demo. Oh, let's see the question. How do we use MoveAir? Okay, well, I'll get you that information, Kunal. Okay. So where do we begin? So let's take a look first at a very generic piece of information. And I'll explain why you need this in a second. But before you start to use your database, your Microsoft Data Assessment tool, you'll need to create a migration project. So a migration project is nothing more than setting up or searching on a new resource inside of your resource group. It's a migration project. You really don't even have to fully name it or any of that kind of stuff. Notice here I've got servers, databases, virtual desktops, web apps, and our encrypted data box technology. But let's look at database. And I'll plug this back in like comedy show. I'll do a callback. Notice I did name this. I've got the project for migration demo migrate project here. And I've got, I don't have any others. I've got some assessed database instances, some assessed databases ready for Azure SQL, databases ready for Azure SQL VMs. And then from here, you can start migrating using your Azure Database Migration Service. It'll kick you off into either learning more about the database migration service and provide information about sort of the next steps. So let's take a look at the Database Migration Advisor, or Assistant, excuse me, Assistant. Database Migration Assistant. So here's some assessments that have already been done. I'll kick one off here in one moment, but here is an assessment against a set of databases asking if these assessed databases are appropriate for my target platform. So the name of my assessment, the source platform, SQL Server, the target platform. I've done a mix: Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instances, and then run these assessments and gotten a few issues back. The SQL Server that I'm running it against is local. I've got about 7 or 8 databases on here that I've run the assessment against. Also, I've got a SQL Server managed instance that I've been working with, and that's got some databases, and I'll show you how I got those on here in just 1 second. So let's do a new assessment. So we'll do just the assessment. Okay, and we'll do AZ SQL or SQL to AZDB. So SQL to Azure SQL Database 05. The assessment type is database engine or integration services. So if I had integration services and packages running on this instance, it would pick those up. But we're gonna do just the database engine. And the source is either AWS RDS for SQL Server or SQL Server itself. So I'm going to say SQL Server itself. And I'm going to say my target type. So where is this assessment going to be sort of aimed at? An Azure SQL database, an Azure SQL database managed instance, SQL Server on virtual machine, or is it going to migrate to is the assessment going to be run against another SQL Server? I'm going to do an Azure SQL database, and I'm going to go ahead and create the assessment. So it's going to check the database compatibility. It's going to check to see which features are on par or when there are issues. And then there's some new features coming soon that as they're released, they'll be a part of the assessment. So I'll hit next. I'll add a source. Oops, excuse me. I'll add a source for this. So I'll use demo SQL Server VM01. That's the only one I really have, but if I had more, it would do that. I'm using SQL Server authentication, and for the sake of not messing around too much and having the demo guides be kind to me, I've left off all the encrypt connection, but trust SQL Server and trust SQL Server certificate. But this allows for that level of security during the assessment or migration process. And then it sees the data sources or the databases that are on here. And I don't want to do all of them because I think that might take a little while. I know yesterday it took about 3 minutes or so so I'll do 3. And I'll add 3 databases to this SQL Server to Azure SQL Database Assessment. And if I had a query file that maybe like a little additional workload to run against this, that would be fine. But I'll go ahead and hit start the assessment. And while it runs, it's doing compatibility issues and feature parity. Feature parity came back pretty quickly. It didn't really see anything too much. It saw some stuff about Azure Key Vault, and it didn't see any real parity issues. Compatibility issues, it should not see too much. We're kind of waiting for this to kind of process through. So that's in progress, and we'll go back and look at that in 1 second. So if we take a look at an assessment that was done, Demo Migration Assessment 003, also SQL Server with the target and source being, or the source being SQL Server, the target being Azure SQL Database. Open the assessment. We can see that it ran against this database yesterday, compatibility issues. Again, it opens up all the databases that it ran against, migration changes or migration blockers, behavioral changes, full text search has changed since SQL Server 2008. That could be something that we need to tweak or look at. And again, I didn't make a lot of code changes or schematic changes that would flag these processes, but it's taking a look at compatibility at SQL Server level 2019, as well as one node down, SQL Server 2017, 2016. And it's also doing and I uploaded these, I uploaded to Azure Migrate. For uploading to Azure Migrate, it's going to either China, Germany, US Gov. I'll hit connect. That load. And this is where you need your Azure Migrate project. This that I showed you earlier, this is where you'll need that. It's saying Azure Migrate project, and I'll say upload this data. Assessment uploaded. And then you can go into Azure Migrate and take a look if you needed to additional information about the migration. So I'll go back over here. We'll open the assessment. This is the one we just did. Open the assessment. Again, it didn't find a lot of feature parity issues, and it didn't find a lot of migration blockers, behavioral changes, deprecation features, or information issues. And we didn't really expect it to. I didn't do a lot to that. I'll go ahead and upload that to my Azure migration project. And yes, it does ask for authentication each time. Bit of a pain. And it also uploads per database. So I've got 3 databases that I had. I'll just do one, but it will require you to do this upload, I believe, 3 different times, unless I'm doing something wacky, which is totally possible, but. So there's the assessment. Let's see, it should refresh. Takes a second to refresh the tools in the migration project. This should say assessed databases should be 9 here in a moment. So database is ready for Azure SQL DB. Let's go ahead and open this up. Take a look what this shows us. It'll show a list of databases that were assessed. It'll show their initial size, what their targets were. Again, migration blockers, breaking changes, ready for Azure SQL DB, ready for Azure SQL VM, and what the compatibility level is. It'll show you if it's not ready for a migration. So some real good info, or some nice summary information there. So let's take a look, excuse me, at migrating data into Azure with the migration assistant. So we'll do database engine, SQL Server is my source, Azure SQL Database is my target, and we'll go ahead and hit create. And of course, my source is going to be the SQL Server I'm used to using, SQL Server authentication type. I'm just going to migrate a single database, but I'll show you how this works. It's pretty nice. Go ahead and add. Wait. You know what? I did the wrong thing. I didn't do migration. Sorry about that. Now, notice on the migration scope, you can say managed instance if you're going to move data, but it'll say, I don't know if you can see that or not, but it'll say use the database migration service, which I will show you in a moment. It'll say use the Azure Database Migration Service for performing schema and data migrations to Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. So we're not going to do managed instance. And we're going to move schema and data. And we're going to create. Got our server name that we can drop down to. Hit connect. And we'll just do one database. Next. And connect to target server. And I've got my little handy dandy list of servers. And again, if you're familiar with the Azure SQL database, there's still a server that the Azure SQL database lives on. You're not responsible for that server other than a firewall type situation and maybe backup policies. You don't really have any interaction with this server if you're running an Azure SQL database. But I've got my server name in there and my password. And again, for the sake of the demo guides, we won't mess around with all the trusted connections stuff. And for our source database, we're going to use demo DB05. That's preparing the source database schema and all that kind of good stuff. And it's going to do two things. Notice it says select source. Here, let's take a look at this. Let me get rid of this server. Notice what all it's pulling across. It's doing triggers. It's doing full text catalogs. It's doing all of your schemas, except for DBO and stuff like that. But it's doing all the user schemas. The store procedures. It's bringing over a couple of tables. It's flagging the different types of behavior changes should it see a table present. XML collections, views, user-defined functions. All of your schema is going over there. So it's going to generate a SQL script. I'm going to go ahead and hit generate script. And it'll generate this script for you to review or maybe edit or save and deploy later. But it'll script out all the schema objects, and then you hit deploy, and it deploys the schema objects onto the server. While that's doing, I'll go out to Azure, and we'll go out to our demo DB05. There's a bunch of different ways to get to it. I use the resource group. It's sort of the 0 point for searching in Azure. So I have different things. So there's my demo DB005. Oops, excuse me. And we're just kind of waiting for that. We'll come back to this just momentarily. And so here's my schema that's ready to be saved or copied or edited in any way you need to do, whatever you see fit. But anyway, I'm going to worry about this, deploy schema. I'm going to hit deploy schema on this little button down below. And it's going to take a couple of minutes here to deploy, I believe, 1,600 some odd objects into the new database. Because right now the database is empty. So it does the schema first, and then you can migrate your data. So, 2,300 objects. So it'll be done here momentarily. And go from there. Are there any questions about anything up until this point while we're waiting for the schema to kick off? Remember, this is the data migration assistant. If I was going to do this whole operation against a Azure SQL managed instance, I would use the data migration assistant, or the database migration service in Azure. While that's cooking, let's go back over here, and what I'll do is this. And while that's, let's see if it's still, I'll just quickly show you the database migration assistant. Notice I've got an Azure Database Migration Service. You create that as a root, sort of a shell project. So I went click happy on you here. Oh my God, sorry. Let me try that again, just really quickly. So here's an overview of a database migration service with one project in it, Demo Migration SQL to AZDB. That was an attempt right there to move from SQL Server to Azure SQL Database. You can start and stop the service. You can create a new project with the database migration service. Where the source type is SQL Server, MongoDB, MySQL, AWS, Postgres, Oracle, RDS for SQL Server. And you can have the target be SQL database on a virtual machine, Azure SQL Managed Instance, or Azure SQL Database Activity, or Azure SQL Database period. And then from here, you can also download and install the Migration Assistant. And then you can also create a new project and run that activity. Let's go back out to our assistant and notice that in the Data Migration Assistant, our script for the schema has been completely run. And then we'll go ahead and hit Migrate Data. And then we've taken a look at all that we want to migrate. We want to migrate all of our tables and all that kind of good stuff. Then you can start your data migration by clicking yep, and it's going, and it'll run for a couple of minutes. And what we're looking at for the data migration is a couple things. If we go into Query Editor, a preview feature, and connect to the server, you can see, yeah, there's the human resources tables, all the newly migrated tables for a person dot and production dot, the schema, object name, syntax right there. We'll do a query once the data migration assistant is wrapped up, and it's cooking on through. There's the progress area. It's got 56 data up. Yep. And that in the success is increasing, in progress is decreasing. So it's a little bit more. It's right about halfway done. So it'll be done in a second, and we'll do a query and then see if you guys got any questions. Hold on. Any questions in the interim? Okay, so this is going. Almost done, almost done. All right, looking good, looking good, looking good.
So, Tim, I have one question.
Sure.
So when we are doing the managed instance migration online, do we need to have backup with checksum enable as a prerequisite? Because I think I had faced that issue before, but I'm not sure that's kind of requirement.
I don't know if it does. I think it does a checksum. It might.
Because what we were doing, we were taking our own native backups, like T-logs and the full backup. And I think to pick up those backup, I think it was giving some kind of validation throwing, saying the backup has to be checksum enable or something.
Sure.
Or maybe. So that might be kind of requirement to just have the proper backup or verified or not.
It does integrity checks. I'm not sure. I'm sure it does something like a checksum, but not exactly sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Notice here's the results. Here's the messages. It pulled back about 19,000 rows. So it now has data moved from on-prem or a local version of SQL Server out into, out into Azure SQL Database. Real quick, and I'll close. Here's an example of how you can do a backup and restore with managed instance. If you, for example, load SQL Server, or excuse me, Azure Data Explorer, Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer, Storage Explorer. Download that, connect with your account login credentials, and then browse to the storage containers that you built for whatever project or under your account. For example, I have a container called SQL Backups. I've uploaded, hitting the upload tool, I've uploaded from my local machine I've uploaded a .back file, adventureworks.back, and it's now out in the cloud. Everything, all the storage here is out in the cloud. So if I wanted to, I could go and hit my managed instance. This is my managed instance right here. Hit restore database. Hit device. And again, there's probably a million different ways to do this. It pulls down my storage container. Make me sign into Azure. I'm going to verify who I am. So there's my storage account, my storage container. I'll create a quick credential or my signature that says this is who I am. Hit OK. I'll have it restored as AdventureWorks 2019. The backup is D from this URL-based backup folder. That should be done here in a minute. So while that's going, are there any other questions about the database tools that we talked about? While that's cooking, I'll come back to that in 1 second. About the database migration assistant. I know I only went through it really quickly, but the database migration service, the database experiment assistant, even Azure Storage Explorer, because you'll need these tools to kind of pull everything together, or anything about migration using SQL Server Management Studio. And you can use Management Studio to do things like move a data tier application. You can use import export as a component to move data into maybe another large database, and then use another tool to move the database or the schema out into the cloud. So there's a lot of different ways to do SQL Server migrations. We just talked about a couple of them today. Here's AdventureWorks 2019 D restored successfully. And here's all my tables. And my data is there. I'll just do this. There we go. Well, all righty, guys. It took you 10 minutes after the hour. I apologize. Let's see. Stephen Wheeler. Is it possible to migrate SQL agent jobs to Azure managed instances? I don't think so. I think you have to. Maybe, Stephen. Let me get back with you on an answer, because that's a good question. Can you move an agent job to an Azure SQL managed instance? It doesn't look like that with the tools, but I'm sure there's migration tools to do it, but I'll find out an answer for you. Can I use the Attunity connector for Oracle with Database Migration Assistant? Yes, you can use all the Attunity suite of tools for the migration, specifically for Oracle with the Database Migration Assistant. Good questions. All right, do we have any other questions, or are we ready to wrap up? Go and enjoy the weekend. All right. I'm looking over here. Sorry. The camera's right here. Is the difference between using Database Migration Assistant and Database Migration Service, is the latter works for you? Yes. With the Database Migration Service, you can only move, or not only move, but you can move the Azure SQL Managed Instance. With the Data Migration Advisor or the Data Migration Assistant, you can't move schema or data into an Azure SQL Managed Instance. That is the difference, yes. So I'll get you an answer, Stephen, about agent jobs to Azure SQL Managed Instance, and then I'll I'll probably post it on the discussion thread so everybody can see the question and the answer. All righty, guys, I'm going to stop the recording and go have a good weekend.